So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar in our series of looking at our new roles in primary care networks and support for primary care employers. Today we're talking about our personalised care roles, social prescribing link workers, care coordinators and health coaches, and we're very pleased to welcome Giles Wilmore and Juida Idu to the call today. Housekeeping, we're not expecting any fire alarms. We are recording these webinars, and that's so that we can share it with our colleagues in GM, so please be aware this is being recorded. And Natasha is quite right, we need to collect some excellent feedback after each of these webinars, so your feedback at the end would be grateful. We will be keeping an eye on the chat. Please use that function, and if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, no problem. Natasha, have I forgotten anything?
No, I think you've covered everything nicely. I think just to start, before the webinar starts, and really to warm people up, I think I'd like to know what you expect to learn from this webinar, you know, what you expect to get from it, and also where you're from. Whereabouts in Manchester, or are you beyond Manchester? Please let us know in the chat box. Back over to you, Ali.
Thanks, Natasha. Juida and Giles, are we okay to hand over to you, do you think?
Yes, that's fine.
Hi, Ali, it's Giles here. Yes, absolutely. I think I'm going to go first, and then I'm going to hand over to Juida. And is it yourself operating the slides, Natasha?
It's going to be Liam operating, so it'll be next slide, Liam.
Okay, Liam. I'll do my very bad Chris Whitty impression when I need you to move on, if that's okay. So yes, just to introduce myself to everybody on the webinar first, I am the Associate Lead for People and Communities at the Greater Manchester Health and Care Partnership. So that means I lead on a range of programmes where we offer support across all 10 CCG local authority areas of Greater Manchester around programmes of work which are focused on community-based support for people to supplement what's available through healthcare services. So social prescribing is one of the programmes we're actively involved in promoting and supporting across Greater Manchester. And I'll leave my colleague Juida to introduce herself when I hand over to her. But what I'm going to do is take you through a few slides now just to give you a little bit of context and background around social prescribing particularly, and then to talk about the three different roles that Ali has already mentioned, and to sort of talk a bit through how they might work alongside each other and within your wider context. And then Juida will talk from her own experience as a practicing GP in working with social prescribing in her practice. Thanks, Liam. If we can move on one. Oh, and another, thank you. So this slide really just demonstrates what you will all know already, that the causes of health and well-being are wide and varied, and that the wider determinants of health account for most of our health and well-being status. So the graphic on the left-hand side of the slide comes from a piece of work done by the Health Foundation 2 years ago called What Makes Us Healthy. And through that research, they estimated that only around 10% of our health and wellbeing status is directly linked to our access to healthcare services, and that the other 90% is linked to all the things pictured in the diagram: our work, our food, our surroundings, our housing, transport, social connections, education, etc., etc. And then alongside that, another Health Foundation study from 2013 did a calculation and estimated that an average time spent by somebody with one or more long-term condition with a healthcare professional is about 4 hours a year. So obviously some more than that, some less than that, it's an average. But that means obviously there's a huge amount of time, as you will know full well, that people are struggling and managing on their own within communities. So the focus of social prescribing and other such community-based interventions is threefold, really. Firstly, to focus on prevention of deteriorating health. Secondly, to focus on supporting better self-care by people within their own homes, families and communities when they do have ongoing conditions and health challenges. And thirdly, to draw on the assets and support available in their community, what's generally referred to as adopting asset-based approaches. Thanks, Liam. So this slide just summarises some of the types of benefits that can be drawn from social prescribing, and this comes from a piece of work undertaken, a literature review undertaken in 2017 by the University of Westminster, which hosts the National Social Prescribing Network. And obviously there aren't data on this slide to underpin this, although there are a lot of studies with data attached to them that we can reference. But as a summary, we're talking about benefits to the individual, particularly around their own physical and emotional health and well-being. So different metrics are used, such as SWEMWebs, ONS4, Outcome Star, etc. But they repeatedly show individuals reporting higher self-confidence, self-esteem, improved emotional well-being in particular, but also often physical well-being as they get out and about, they're less isolated. So starting to address the social determinants of health by connecting people who would otherwise be more marginalised and disadvantaged, and also encouraging behaviour change. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but one of the key aspects of these personalised care roles is to work with an individual on a very tailored and personalised package of support, so people are more likely to follow through with it because they've designed something that's really tapping into their own needs, interests and personal circumstances. But there's also a benefit to the community because it draws heavily on community groups and activities. The importance of building up the capacity of the voluntary sector and those local community groups is one of the necessities of social prescribing, and if it's done well, one of the wider benefits. And finally, the green kind of column there's a real benefit to the health and care system. The business cases for social prescribing tend to be based on evidence which from this literature review and others suggests a significant decrease in usage of healthcare services by people supported through social prescribing. So typically in the range of 25% reduction in GP attendances, A&E attendances, and also reduction in dependency and other healthcare interventions. Thanks, Liam. And this diagram just summarises the key stages of a typical social prescribing referral pathway. It's from what we call the holistic model, which is beyond simple signposting and just pointing somebody in the right direction, but really treating it as a care pathway through which an individual is supported on the whole journey, as you would in any other care pathway. So starting at the top of the diagram, the GP will be able, or indeed other colleagues within the practice, practice nurses, etc., physiotherapists, pharmacists, any number of professionals are able to make referrals now into social prescribing. But the referral can be made direct from the main GP systems such as EMIS and Vision through the click of a button which makes the social prescribing referral. It'll pull through the key demographic data onto the system that we have procured for Greater Manchester, which is known as Elemental. It's a freestanding social prescribing platform now being used by 7 of the 10 CCG local authority areas. That pulls through the basic demographic information about the individual. You would just add in a sentence or two on your reasons for referring. That then goes directly into the Elemental system and is picked up by the social prescribing service, who allocate a link worker to the individual. Link workers often have, as we will come on to, different job titles. Community navigators, care connectors, all sorts of titles are used. The key thing is that link worker has much more time, typically 45 minutes to an hour in an initial appointment, to try and really get to know the whole situation that that person's in, to have that person-centered conversation about their wider circumstances, so not just focusing on the particular illness or condition or issue that the person is presenting with, but to try and get to know their circumstances, to also get to understand their interests, motivations, what's likely to help them going forward. There is also access to a care and support plan. This is a non-clinical wellbeing plan that allows the individual or their link worker to document the wider circumstances and hopes and goals that they hope to achieve. That's also now available on the Elemental system. It will in due course be going onto the GraphNet platform. At that point, the social prescription is made, and that's effectively an onward referral into community groups, activities, peer support, networks, whatever practical, emotional or social support the individual feels they need. And that's almost always provided by the voluntary and community sector in local groups and activities. And obviously during the COVID pandemic period, much of that has had to switch online or be safely socially distanced. So it's made social prescribing quite sort of challenging practically during the current period. Thanks, Liam. This is just a summary of where we are in Greater Manchester. We've had about 25,000 social prescribing referrals last year, so that's about 1% of the population. It's continuing to grow this year. We've got now all 10 borough areas of Greater Manchester offering social prescribing services, so it's the largest city region in the country to have 100% service offer. Around 8 in 10 GP practices now making social prescribing referrals, but that varies hugely from practices where just one GP is an enthusiast and referrer and others aren't, through to practices where it's very clearly embedded as a service offer that the practice regularly uses. We've got the digital platform in place, as I've already mentioned. We've also got quite a comprehensive range of training and support available for link workers and social prescribing across Greater Manchester, which I'll mention a little bit later. And we've recently just been selected as one of 7 national demonstrator sites around the country for green social prescribing. So we'll be looking to do more to connect people with the natural environment as part of their health and recovery. Thanks, Liam. Oh, and then we'll move on again one, please. So the key roles that have already been mentioned in personalised care. I've talked a lot about social prescribing, and as I say, that is the link worker role summarised here on this NHS England slide, is typically the point where somebody with more complex or wide-ranging social support needs would be referred by the healthcare professional. A lot of those referrals often have a mental or emotional health component, often involving people with complex needs, people who are lonely or isolated with one or more long-term conditions. That's been particularly the case during the pandemic, obviously. The other 2 roles in summary, the health and wellbeing coach will in many ways work alongside the social prescribing link worker and will typically focus more on the clinical components of the care and support somebody needs. So we'll be picking up people with particular physical or mental health long-term conditions, and we'll be looking at how to offer them support around self-care, patient education, how to connect them with advice, improve their knowledge, skills and guidance around the management of their own condition, whereas the link workers often picking up more of the social and community support aspects that are available. And finally, the care coordinator, again, similar role, works closely with the other 2, but is really looking to coordinate care for people who have multiple appointments and are really struggling to navigate the system. And this can often be frail or elderly people, people with learning disabilities, people with complex care needs that need a bit of support to coordinate their package of care and really sort of understand how to get the best out of the system of support that's there. Thanks, Liam. And then really just got one slide each that goes into a little bit more detail on these 3 roles. So I'm not going to read through all of these. They'll be there in the pack for your information, but there's a little bit more detail on what the social prescribing link worker can offer. Similarly, the health and wellbeing coach, where there's a link there to click through to the NHS England site for the role descriptor, and there should be finally one, Liam, on the Care Coordinator role. So those are the 3 roles. If you want to just click on again, please, Liam. I think I've nearly finished now on my part. The support available, there's a regional network in the Northwest for both link workers and social prescribing, which we are part of in Greater Manchester, but we also run our own support networks within Greater Manchester for link workers. So we run a series of webinars on topics chosen by the link workers. We run induction support for link workers. We have a starter pack. We do monthly newsletters. There's a Facebook group for sort of informal support and connection. And we run a number of sort of network events, which are currently obviously online, but used to be face-to-face. So there's quite a lot of support in the GMP community for link workers. And then the future NHS collaboration platform they can access as well for all the materials and information that is put out by NHS England. Thanks, Liam. And then this is, I think, my final slide before I hand over to Juida, and then we'll be happy to take any questions at the end. But we did a survey fairly recently of Greater Manchester link workers. We have about 200 now across Greater Manchester, and they vary from those who are directly employed by PCNs, those who are funded through the ARRS funding but are employed through host organisations, often in the voluntary sector, and those who were already in place as part of commissioned social prescribing services, again, often in the voluntary sector, but predating the new PCN funding becoming available through the GP contract. And we particularly asked the link workers around their supervision and around the support, because, as I'm sure colleagues are aware, one of the contractual requirements in the funding available through the contract is that clinical supervision support is given to link workers. And this slide summarises what we found. We can share the full details of the survey for those that are interested. But basically, most of the time, our link workers were supporting good access to professional support, particularly from their line managers, so not necessarily clinical supervision. They often felt the clinical supervision could be improved. I don't think this means they need regular contact with a GP per se, but they need to know how to escalate issues where they come across situations with clients that will be of concern to them. So, for example, safeguarding issues that they want to make sure that they've escalated and raised back with the referring clinician. But regular support from their line manager and peer support was also important. So I think what I'm emphasising here is clinical support and supervision is part of the picture, but only part of the picture. The survey also covered learning and development, what they thought their needs were and their satisfaction with the role, and there's some comments there on the slide, but in the interest of time I won't try and read through all of those. So if you want to click on Liam, please. I think I'm going to put myself on mute now and hand over to Juida to introduce herself.
Thank you, Giles. So I'm Juida Edu. I'm a Stockport GP. I work at the Elderly Family Practice. I work in Giles' team as the clinical champion for personalised care, and I'm also the clinical chair of Viaduct, which is the Stockport GP Federation, where all 37 practices have one organisation. We're a community interest company, and we employ around 14 link workers ourselves. So to start with, I think social prescribing in practice, I think it's probably best to describe pre-pandemic and during the pandemic how things and how roles have worked for me. So pre-pandemic, we have link workers attached to all our networks. There's around 2 per network. Their job description at the time was written by myself, actually, about 3 years ago. And it was focused very much on individuals meeting the needs of a specific practice population. There were some core elements around coaching, motivational interviewing, behavioural change, being able to develop personalised support plans. But it was very much a one job description for one person, and then some amendments based on that local population. So in Alvanley, our link worker, we call him a health and wellbeing coordinator, is Rod. And when he joined the practice, he worked with our existing volunteers, of which we had 18 practice volunteers who had already started to understand their community, and from a strength-based approach, provided walking groups, singing groups, and supported our practice allotment. He rapidly became integrated with them, but also became integrated with part of our practice, coaching and supporting some of my receptionists on signposting and navigating conversations, which were really, really helpful, and moving the conversation in perspective to one of person-centered conversation. So asking somebody what matters to them, all very different to how we normally manage that high demand sense of being in a GP practice. What he brought to the practice was amazing, because we could identify at least 20 to 30% of our population having a social need and not a medical need. We were then able to signpost him either directly at the reception area, so they didn't even see a GP, or my practice nurse, or a GP if they identified somebody needing support. The work he did using that skill set, and many of our link workers or wellbeing coordinators in Stockport have a multitude of different skill sets and come from different backgrounds. They're mostly NVQ3 qualified, but they can do additional training. And so his background was working with drugs and alcohol in the prison service, and he was really used to challenging but supporting people to make changes. He worked with our champions and understood our community, and was able to signpost and involve patients in different things. So as time evolved, we started to identify cohorts of patients who may have been struggling or couldn't attend various clinical appointments, but we could see the utilisation at our practice level was quite high, and we could identify who was attending frequently and not all for medical reasons. So we started to use the proactive part, the prevention part, to actually engage with people and invite them in to see Rod. We then started to identify cohorts, so some of our diabetic patients or some of our fibromyalgia patients, and we'd have group consultations in the allotment. And for our diabetic patients, my practice nurse would be there, my PCN pharmacist would be there, and Rod, and the three of them could actually support up to 12 individuals at a time. And if it's good weather, then there was a diabetic friendly meal cooked on the allotment site. So we looked at very innovative ways of trying to manage not just our workload, but trying to support our patients to have the best lives they can. When the pandemic hit, it was very, very different, because obviously we'd lost all that sort of face-to-face contact, and so many people had become vulnerable and isolated, particularly older people, and many of whom didn't have the IT skills to stay digitally connected. And what our link worker did was rapidly work with our practice team and with the mutual aid group, which is the voluntary group based in Woodley, and coordinated how we ensure patients got their medicines delivered to them. We worked with the council so that tablets were delivered to housebound older people, and the volunteers coached those older people to use their tablets, which they picked up, almost all of them picked up very quickly. So we moved to 100% electronic prescribing, and it helped to keep them connected. And as a practice, we have a Facebook page and we do Facebook Lives. So we moved our group consultation to a digital format, but try to ensure that everyone felt included and that it was inclusive because of the way we reached out to them. And so our link worker also, because of his coaching skills and his ability to work with people with stress or depression or anxiety and signpost and support them, he actually did a lot of coaching for our practice team and our practice staff as well. He's an invaluable member of the team, and during the pandemic, doing those telephone comfort calls to those shielded patients. We had a dedicated phone number, and the way he worked with my healthcare assistant and mutual aid groups just meant that we were not only coordinated, but we were really supportive of those individuals at that time and made sure that we could use different formats to do that. So that's sort of a kind of summary really of the way we've really helped and worked together. But we couldn't have done that really without Rod, and you do need somebody who has that type of skill set to bring a community together. And so I think we were also talking about, with regards to self-care and asset-based approaches, all of those that Giles talked about, prevention included, you can see how it culminates when you can really hinge and work with people. Now, I know about those 3 roles, and I was in a meeting earlier today where we were talking about them. And I think my advice is, yes, they're 3 different roles, but actually you need to look at your population, you need to look at your practice, you need to look at your practice population and understand what their needs are. And then you tailor a role, and you've got some generic job descriptions, but think about tailoring the role to meet the needs of the individuals, the patients and the practice. And then from there, you can start to work through how that individual will work with your PCN and how they'll benefit your PCN most and what impact they'll have. I suppose the other thing I would say around supervision, so in Viaduct where I work, we obviously employ all the link workers. So the service lead is also a psychologist by background. So she does offer supervision, both professional and clinical supervision, to our link workers, the band 5 ones, and the band 5 ones provide it to the band 4 ones. So it becomes much easier if you're part of a larger organisation, whether it's the voluntary sector or a federation. But if you've employed somebody at a PCN, it doesn't mean you can't offer that level of supervision and support, because even at a practice level, if somebody comes across, or a link worker comes across, a patient who might be struggling and really wants some clinical advice, whether it's safeguarding or an escalation around suicidal thoughts and risk assessment, then our link worker would just knock on the door and speak to a GP, because he's likely to be doing a clinic in the same building. So there's many ways to kind of support that supervision, or if they're involved as part of the practice meetings or your MDT meetings at a PCN. But it's a crucial, pivotal role, and if you can maximise the potential of that, you can really reap benefits. So that's my kind of very brief description of social prescribing in practice. Do we have another slide? I'm not sure if I was to do another slide. Yes. So I want to finish on a little bit of a high. So you can see Rod in the background. He's on the right-hand side, and he's sitting in our allotment shed at Alvanley. So I think the best way to describe the benefit of having a link worker and what difference they can make to your patients and your practice is by seeing a real case study. So if we'd like to play that, and you can see firsthand Alvanley. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're probably posting the link in the chat. I can try and play it through by sharing it as well.
I've got it set up on Google now if you want me to.
Oh, please, yeah.
Instead. So yeah, sometimes videos don't always work through Teams because they kind of stutter. So I've put the link in there if you want to watch it on your device, and I'll play it through Teams as well. So I'm just going to share my screen now for you.
That's super, thank you.
So let me just make sure I'm sharing my sound as well. So there we go. But there's no sound on it.
No sound. I think you were on mute on the video.
Yeah. So hopefully. Good.
Yep.
My name's Patrick Connell. I'm 74 years of age. Used to be a sales engineer. Did that for about 50 years. Loved it. Really enjoyed it. It was a career, not a job. Basically, it all went a bit pear-shaped a couple of years ago. It just totally affected my health. I was sort of physically ill, you know, and then it sort of affected my mind. I was in a total mess. I just couldn't carry on. Apart from injury and illness, I've only ever had 2 days off in my life. I think I had a breakdown, to be honest. I really do. Like I just always thought when my time was up, I'd be leaving it from work. You know, sounds daft to a lot of people, but my wife rang the desk, and they sort of got me down within about an hour. I needed time to just go over things. Rod will tell you, even in the early stages, I was talking about doing stuff related to my work, because I thought what I might like to do would be still sort of give the benefit of my experience, maybe teaching people at night school, something like that. But that was where I was with a thought saying that there's another thing now. You know, you've had a career if you don't do any more, and in one sense I didn't want to hear it, but in another it was kind of saying, you know, one door closes, and it was the best thing that ever happened. So I'm doing this Men Matters course, which is absolutely brilliant. The lady who is involved with that invited me to the cookery course. I went last week, and literally the first time in my life I cooked a meal. My wife said it wasn't too bad, so and then I was introduced to a lady there last Friday, and she runs a craft course. Well, I've embraced a few things, like with the bowl in particular was the first one. So I'm a member there now. Well, they're more than occupying my mind, because what I did try and do, and Rod said this was important, try and, although you're not doing your career, do something that takes your day. So there's a network, really. There's the allotment, and the practice seems to have a bit of a portfolio of activities and projects that are coming into being. So I feel positive, and I feel in a better place. I'm re-sorting my life out.
Thank you. Hopefully that will give you a flavour of the kind of impact and difference these roles can make. I think that's the end of our presentation. Be good to give you an opportunity now to ask some questions, and I think Ali will be facilitating us.
Thanks, Juida. Thank you, Giles, for that presentation. I'm really grateful that you've shared that with us. That video was brilliant. So you're right, we did end on a high. There's a couple of themes, if I'm honest, that have come through our webinars to date around the new roles, and that is around clinical supervision, and the other thing is around ongoing continuous professional development. Now, a lot of our practices and networks are having to think about these in a new way, because introducing and supporting new colleagues in our practices and networks is a brand new thing. So if you had to share top tips for good clinical supervision and what good CPD looks like for social prescribing link workers, health and wellbeing coaches and care coordinators, that I think that would be quite useful for colleagues.
Shall I answer that one, Giles?
Well, if you want to say something about clinical supervision, Juida, obviously you're better qualified than me to talk about that. I can talk about sort of perhaps some of the wider learning and development landscape.
Yeah, sure. So from a clinical supervision perspective, strictly speaking, it would be the clinical director of every PCN. But if you start to look at a clinical director in a PCN, the reality is they do 1 day a week. And if they had to offer clinical supervision for all the ARRS role as they expand, their entire time would then be used to develop just those staff and not actually get on with doing the rest of the work around meeting their population health needs and population health management. So, and there's also a number of DESs and a huge managerial requirement on them. So I think we might need to rethink whether it should be the clinical director, but the clinical director should have some oversight. I think as GPs ourselves, if a link worker or coordinator is seeing one of our patients in our practice, then it makes sense if they want to have a case-based discussion regarding that individual, it should be us, because we're medically legally responsible for our own patients and we know our own patients. So I have no difficulty, particularly in that kind of case-based discussion or randomly even case-based discussion, is that I think as GPs and GP practices, we should welcome that, because we would have the same conversation if an F2 knocked on your door or if your practice nurse knocked on your door. So my top tip is treat staff who are from ARRS funded staff, PCN staff, as your own. Build that relationship as if they were your own staff. And in terms of improving relationships, improving outcomes for patients, that's the right approach for me for clinical supervision. Although I know in Viaduct, where I work at it, we do have that as well through our service lead, and that's not available to everyone.
Thanks, Juida. It is. There are different models of how social prescribing link workers are supported in practices and PCNs, depending on how the employment works. But I absolutely agree that sometimes the complexity in which we're working and our colleagues, our link workers working, is such that it is not unreasonable to come across some form of concern or some form of safety issue that actually you just need to speak about or share. And it's ultimately good supervision for me is a patient safety function, and we do need to support it. Peter, welcome. Would you like to come in on that note?
Yes, I wish I could canter over the hill on a white charger and solve everything, which I can't, but I'm happy to share where we are and to take the conversation forward. Yes, you're quite right that the way the DES was set up, it does say that the CD, the DGP, would provide the clinical supervision, but I think we've been mindful, both ourselves in NHS England and our colleagues in Health Education England nationally, that the increasing requirement for supervision across all of the new roles that we're looking at, 26,000 additional roles on our side, 6,000 additional GPs on the other. It's a huge challenge to look at the whole need for clinical supervision and linking that to the sort of educational supervision as well that all those roles need. So there is work ongoing between us and Health Education England nationally, looking at potentially other roles, other ways of packaging up the supervision response to meet all those needs. So I'm really pleased to hear about the local ownership that's happening there. Of course, the other dimension for these roles, and we know nationally that 75%, I think it is, of the link workers are actually employed by these voluntary sector type organisations. I'm based in the northeast, and up here we had Ways to Wellness, who was one of the national social prescribing pilots way back in the Building Health Partnerships, when my interest in social prescribing kind of started before I moved into this role. So there are other people on the pitch, if you like, who are there providing supervision for different aspects of the link workers' support when they're employed in these other organisations, because they will have their own supervision and development opportunities as well. So there's quite a bundle of things there. We're very mindful nationally that this is a big challenge across the whole of the ARRS, and indeed, as I said, the expanding workforce more generally. And we are looking at proposing models that might work more effectively to keep the patients safe, keep the staff safe, because they've got to be looked after, but to do that in an effective and efficient way. So I'm happy to come back and share thinking on that as it goes forward. And I'd just like to say as well, yes, I as I say, I've been involved in different ways with social prescribing over a number of years, and then this role that I started last year gives me kind of a legitimate reason to be interested in it, rather than it just being a personal interest one. And yes, I think social prescribing link workers, who were the one role that was there from last year, and the other roles have come on this year, they got a really good name for themselves in the flexibility response they provided for the COVID pandemic, which is really good. And I think that really helped to develop their engagement with the teams in the practices and the teams in the PCNs, and that's been really good. My only concern over that is that kind of welfare support isn't what social prescribing is predominantly there to do. It's much more the holistic, goals focused coaching type approach that's been very well described by Giles and Joida there. So there will be a question of building on the strengths that those individuals have established as part of the response to the pandemic, and indeed as part of deploying different people into the vaccination response, but making sure that we don't lose sight of the vision of what social prescribing and personalised care can offer as we move out of the immediate stage of the pandemic response and into hopefully a more normal sort of life beyond it. Thank you. That was what was in my head at the moment. So,
thanks, Peter. Giles, do you want to come in? Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick reflection on clinical supervision from me, from a non-clinician, and then I'll talk about the wider learning and development, continuing professional development. I think, as we found in our survey, that slide I showed, I think we've got to see clinical supervision in the round of other forms of supervision, but basically there's management supervision. Managerial line management supervision around the role and the function, how to undertake it. And then we also found that sort of informal peer support, emotional support for linked workers dealing with quite, as other NHS staff are dealing with quite stressful and harrowing stories from individual patients or clients is very important. But on the clinical supervision, I think, Ali, you and Joida hit the nail on the head, really. It's about safeguarding and safety, and it's about making sure that, I mean, bearing in mind that link workers and the other two roles are non-clinical roles. So by definition, they're not dealing with clinical caseloads, but inevitably patients who present with wider social issues, those are mixed in with issues that need clinical support. You can't separate them. So it's really, and Joida mentioned, for example, patients with suicidal ideation. It's examples like that where a link worker may feel out of their depth supporting somebody and may feel and should feel that there's a need to, from a safeguarding point of view, sort of have a route of escalation, if you like, and somebody that they can go and ask advice and support from. Now, I think it's impractical, as Joida said, for that to be a single named lead GP in any PCN. It should be the referring clinician, in my view, whether that's a GP, practice nurse, whoever the person making the referral should be able to be contacted back through the system and say, you know, look, this is the feedback on your patient and this is a concern that I've unearthed that you may or may not already know about that I think you ought to be aware of. So I think there's more work to do on looking at those different models, but it should be alongside wider supervision. In terms of ongoing professional development for link workers and the other groups, for link workers in particular, there is still at the moment no standardised national training. There's more and more material coming on board, a good online course in modules being developed from Health Education England. We're working in Greater Manchester with the Royal Society for Public Health to pilot a taught module around mental health and emotional health issues, where that will be a trainer model where we will have lead trainers within the link worker community training their peers and colleagues across Greater Manchester. That's going to roll out early in the next financial year, so there'll be more information on that through our networks. The other thing we're working on, again with PHE and Health Education England, is Greater Manchester potentially being a pilot site for the community wellbeing professional role descriptor that PHE have developed as part of this sort of apprenticeship levy, so that we would then look at a funding route to provide a comprehensive training package for link workers. Initially, that's been looked at as a sort of, I think it's a level 3 or level 4, but ultimately there's the option to go with that to sort of degree level as well. So you could see in the longer term, the core training that a link worker will need to come into role being more standardised and a clear funding route potentially being available through the levy system. And then for career progression, what we find already is that the most experienced link workers, often then the obvious career progression is to become a manager of a social prescribing service. But again, there are no standardised professional sort of benchmarks for that. So these are options that are being explored. The Primary Care Institute is also looking to develop more standardised training modules for link workers and other personalised care professionals, but it's very much a moving feast, I'm afraid, at the moment, and therefore the core responsibility lies with the employing organisation, whether that's the PCN or in Greater Manchester. Like Peter said, most of our link workers are employed through the VCSE or through, in Juida's case, GP Federation. So hopefully that's a bit of an overview on that.
And just a bit of further reflection, when we talk to our other colleagues in other webinars, obviously our approach in general practice and primary care is to make general practice a really great place to work, where our new colleagues can learn, develop and thrive. So having those CPD opportunities and having those opportunities clearly described, mapped out and accessible, does offer that career framework, because ultimately, the general practice that we know is changing. Primary care network teams are being built, and we do want our aim, I suppose, from a general practice point of view, is to build a team that wants to stay together, learn together, develop together, and it's all these extra added bits of information that our practices, federations, networks, employers do need to know about, so it can be a really great place to work and you can see your career develop. It isn't just a cul-de-sac of an opportunity. So thanks for that. I'll quit talking for the moment. I've got a bit of a croaky voice today. Are there any questions from the floor then, colleagues on the call for Giles or Juida or even Peter? Any reflections on how it's going in your practices, networks, localities that you think would be useful?
Chris, I thought that you would like to come in, because I know that you like to participate in these webinars, and I know you've always got something wonderful to say. Throwing the spotlight on you.
No pressure. So hi, I'm Chris. I work at Trafford CCG. I was just reflecting. I don't know how much clinical supervision the social prescribers in our West network in Trafford get. I'm not a primary care network director, so I didn't appoint the person, but I've referred plenty of people to her. I think she just asks questions as we go along. I think so I would agree with, I think Peter said about the referring clinician being the point of contact, or was it Giles? I can't remember. One of you mentioned that. I think that'd be good. I think if I refer someone to the social prescriber, they should feel happy to just come back to me and say, is this a bit much, or what should I do here? And I would echo that the primary care network directors are bombed out with loads of work, and they can't be the people doing that. So I know I have lots to say, but that's probably all I've got to say on this. But don't know. Does anyone else want to chip in? Any thoughts?
Thanks, Chris.
I just wondered, Natasha and Ali, I mean, I glossed over fairly quickly the three different roles in the presentation, and obviously the information's in the slides there, and I think Juida pointed out that there is a lot of synergy between these roles, but I don't know whether it's helpful to try and unpick that in a bit more detail, or indeed to hear people's thoughts on this, because I don't think we're necessarily saying you would need all three roles all of the time. In an ideal world, of course, what I try to describe is how they would work together if you did have all three roles working alongside each other in an integrated team. I think the key point I would emphasise, which Juida mentioned, is the ability to be more proactive proactive. So I think our experience of social prescribing is much of it is fairly reactive, in the sense that, as Chris has just described, a primary care clinician will have a patient that they recognise would benefit from social prescribing and make that onward referral, but it's sort of reacting to when the patient appears for an appointment or whatever. I think the other two roles give you that opportunity to be a bit more proactive and get on the front foot and do some work around your lists and around your frequent attenders, and try and sort of proactively design care plans and approaches with them that will then not only alleviate pressure on your services, but also hopefully give them a more tailored and personalised response. But I would say this, wouldn't I? I think the social prescribing link worker is key in all of this. I think without that, you don't then have the mechanism. If you have a care coordinator or a health and wellbeing coach without social prescribing, you don't have an easy mechanism to bring in all that community-based voluntary sector support and connection. So I would say start with the social prescribing link worker if you aren't doing this already, and build up that capacity and knowledge around them. And if it's a relatively small caseload, as Joida has highlighted, that person will effectively probably do some element of the other roles as well anyway. But as the PCN then builds up its caseload and needs to expand, you might look to supplement link workers with one or other or both of the other roles to try and be more proactive in sort of case management and targeting those patients who will benefit most, specifically.
And thanks, Giles. I was reflecting on the bit of work that GP Board in Greater Manchester are doing, and that is helping primary care networks to understand the population health needs of their people and communities, because whilst we have the opportunity to have all of these roles, as you all have said, it's purposeful recruiting, being meaningful and really understanding the needs of your citizens and your population is critical. And I think as primary care networks develop, and as we use our data in a more sophisticated way, I think we'll be able to flex the workforce depending on our population health needs. At the moment, we're all on a very steep learning curve, both about our populations and about the new roles, which is why kind of we're here just to offer a bit more understanding about each of the roles and what they could offer. It is about building the team in the long run. So it might be worth, if I'm honest, coming back and with a few case studies of how different networks or localities have used these roles in a different way for different reasons. And that might be quite useful. And if we look back at our population health data, because ultimately we're here to do the best for our citizens and populations, aren't we? It would be good to just reflect on those. So they're my closing thoughts. Go on, Giles.
And particularly on the health and wellbeing coach and the care coordinator roles, Ali, because as I mentioned earlier, we were well on the road on social prescribing within Greater Manchester anyway when the PCN funding for link workers came in. That's already been in for a year longer than the other two roles. So I'm not saying we wouldn't be interested in hearing more about how the link worker roles are operating, and particularly those who are working directly within PCNs rather than within the VCSE. But we've got a lot of intelligence on that and a lot of good connections. We've got limited understanding ourselves of how the other two roles are working in practice, or indeed the extent to which they are prevalent across Greater Manchester. As I say, we know from survey work we've done, we have around 200 link workers in Greater Manchester. If I look at, combined all the different employment routes. But for the other two, I couldn't give you a figure. I don't have a feel for how prevalent they are, or indeed how those roles are being developed as it goes on. So I think that is certainly one to come back to. That's
really good. And we should note that, Natasha and Rob, for our forward planning. So thanks for that. That's really good. Any further closing thoughts? Natasha, do you want to do anything around evaluation?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, these webinars, I thought it was a really good discussion today. Thank you. And obviously, you know, Giles and Joida will know this, that I fully support the role of social prescribing link workers. And I just think it's so important to have a handful of them in every PCN, you know. But in terms of like evaluation and stuff, I have dropped a link to our evaluation form, which is in the chat. And because these webinars are for you, we just want to know how we've done. If we've done really good, let us know. If we've done really badly, also let us know, because, you know, it's a learning curve and we can improve for the next time. But thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you to all our wonderful presenters. Thank you for Peter as well for joining us. And Chris, thank you to you too, because I did sort of throw you out there, didn't I? And you responded well. So our next webinar is next week, the 2nd of March, and for that we will be focusing on the roles of pharmacy technician and also physician associate. So if you've not already signed up to that, I'll drop in the link so you can sign up to it, and I just look forward to seeing you all then.
Okay, thank you everyone.